Good morning. I'm not used to speaking to a large group in my life. I speak one-on-one and in small groups quite a bit because I'm one of those silver-tongued devils of a lobbyist that you hear about so much in television and the popular media. Kirby called me a couple of months ago and said, would you be interested in coming and visiting with our folks here today? And I said, sure. I had no idea that the bill would be over or how timely this particular headline would be 180 degrees from yesterday. So yesterday at 3 o'clock-ish, Senate Bill 181 was signed, and it is now officially the law of the land because it didn't have a start date. It has a start date of upon signature. So like many speakers, I want to begin with a little homily. My homily comes from that well-known politician and public speaker Woody Allen, who tells a joke that I heard as a child that talks about he has a brother that thinks he's a chicken, and a friend of his says, well, why don't you take him to a psychiatrist to get him fixed? And he said, well, we would, but we need the eggs. So oil and gas in this analogy is the eggs. Everybody has an opinion about it. Everybody wants to fix it. But the one true thing is that we all need the eggs. Because it's not just light and heat. It's part of everything. Half of the substance we produce every day goes into everything that is not related to heat and lights and mobility. It's the bicycle tires. It's the carbon in your fly rod. It's the modern recreation economy doesn't happen without it, at least under today's circumstances. So it's an important thing, and the tone of 181 changes everything 180 degrees from what this state's known since the 1950s when the Oil and Gas Commission was originally created. So what I want to do today with you, besides maybe not bore you to death, is talk a little bit about sort of a high-level view of what's in the bill and how sweeping and comprehensive the bill is. And I know Jeff Robbins will be speaking, and he'll be able to talk more probably about these things and implementation, since his role is going to be largely about that implementation. So foster versus regulate. As some of you know, the mission of the agency was to foster oil and gas development, and that was put in at a time when oil and gas was coming of age in our modern economy, and we really needed it in a way that we still need today, but we put into statute we wanted to foster it, husband it, bring it along, so to speak. That is something that's irritated a number of people for quite a while, and that changed in this bill to the word regulate. So the commission now will be tasked to regulate. It always was tasked to regulate, but I think some saw that as a two-headed hydra, and so now it has a single head to regulate. The biggest thing the bill did was repeal preemption. Preemption was a case law through time. That gave the state primacy in a very famous case that many of you know, Bowen v. Edwards. It sort of gave a dual regulatory structure to oil and gas that said local governments can regulate except where the state has preempted the playing field. And so that's kind of how our laws have grown up over the last 30 years or so. Now it's pretty much a dual regulatory environment. The bill also deals with pooling, the concept of how you aggregate rights in order to get access to the mineral. We had one of the most liberal laws in the country with respect to how those aggregations happened. Now we don't. And in fact, operators are going to have to start out with trying to get 45% of the various mineral owners to agree to have their minerals pooled and so forth. One of the things that one of your local representatives, Ray Scott, did on the Senate floor is he got an amendment that differentiated between the oil wells and gas wells. The oil wells of the eastern slope, I shouldn't say eastern slope, Front Range, Wattenberg area, have have oil and gas and lots of natural gas liquids in them, and so they have higher revenue streams. And so the standard 12.5% in the pooling law switched now to 16% on those oil wells, and gas wells went from 12.5% to 13%. And so because most of those wells on this side of the mountain are gas wells, the state did try to make a differentiation of those particular resources. Air quality is also in the Act. The Air Quality Commission is also given some tasks to do some rulemaking that I will describe as measure, measure, measure. So continuous monitoring is probably coming at some point. I think there'll be some phase-in of some of these things, but there are lots of regulations that are, or rulemakings, I should say, that have been prescribed in this bill, 12 or 13 different ones that I am not going to talk about today in great detail. The issue of economic reasonableness and technical feasibility. Virtually every one of our other state laws with air, water, waste, mine land reclamation, and formerly oil and gas, put regulations sort of subject to, or they had to be done in light of, economically reasonable and technically feasible. Those words are gone from the statute now. They've been replaced with, as introduced, we'll talk about amendments in a minute, but they've been replaced with the words reasonable or reasonable and necessary, depending on what part of the bill you're looking at. There's also a commission reorganization. So currently, oil and gas technical expertise is 3 of the members. That will be dropping to 1 very soon. And then after a year, the commission will be professionalized, and the number of people will be dropped from 9 to 5, and 1 of which will be oil and gas, and others will be other areas of expertise: environmental, soil, agriculture, wildlife, lots of other kinds of expertise on that. And I think the thinking there is that because oil and gas touches so many lives, we ought to have a lot of different viewpoints on how to produce the resource on the state commission. Local governments were pretty much given full-on local control to regulate the surface. As introduced, the bill, it was regulate downhole, regulate everything. It was narrowed to more traditional land use kinds of things. It also deals with waste, the term waste. And waste is not like trash in the bill. Some of you know this, but waste is, it's a waste to leave it in the ground. So now that term waste has been modified, that it's okay to leave it in the ground as long as it's for done so for reasons for health, safety, welfare, and the environment. So that is brand new and very different than most other states. 1041 powers. A number of you in local government probably know what 1041. That was the bill number that was passed probably before time happened, but it's mostly been used to stop water projects in the state. The Oil and Gas Commission or the oil and gas industry was put in a position to be the filter for which local governments had to go through in order to exercise 1041 for purposes of oil and gas development. That has been removed as well. So that's a new authority that's somewhat maybe not unknown, but how that's going to spin out or whether it will spin out at all is something to keep an eye on the ball. So amendments that mattered to the industry. These are only a few. There were a number of amendments that were made that went beyond this, but from my perspective, insertion of the terms reasonable and necessary at least is a backstop of some sort to keep the regulatory environment of the local government in check in some fashion, and we have a conversation, the dialogue, about how implementation should happen. Without that, I think it would have been easy for those that do not want to see any oil and gas in the state at all to take things to court and basically shut us down. So that was a very big deal. There's also a process in the bill that is new, in that the 6,000 permits that were submitted post introduction of Initiative 112 seemed like a lot to people. I think people in the industry were trying to hedge as to whether or not 112 would pass. They would have some permits in the pipeline. So the decision by the majorities was made that we were, instead of having those 6,000 be done under the old system, they would be subject to the new system, and the head of the commission would be the gatekeeper for how those progressed according to some criteria that were put into the, not put into the bill, but there would be 30 days after passage. So today is day one. They're going to have to go through and they've initiated a public process to decide what criteria are going to be used to look at these 6,000 to see whether they go into a side eddy of some sort or whether they get to go through the regular process. So this is something that we were able to change. As introduced, the executive director of the Oil and Gas Commission could refuse to see a permit or move one on. He's only able to delay them now. So they will all be addressed in some fashion. We talked about pooling already. We talked a little bit about the surface uses, the narrowing of that. Another amendment was added about no extraterritorial regulation. There was a concern that because some communities have urban growth boundaries that extend 2 miles, that they would somehow try to reach outside their own city boundary to regulate extraterritorial. You can imagine how some counties may have felt about that, given some of you have been through the flagpole annexation wars, and it's not always harmony between our local governments. So this, at least, there's a bright line between who gets to regulate what, where, and when. So that was put into the bill. So here's a listing. Most of these, probably 90%, are listed in the bill of local authority now that is available to you. That is, and by the way, can I just do a show of hands of who's from industry here this morning, representing industry, and now who is representing local governments? Perfect. That's about half and half. As they used to say on Saturday Night Live, talk amongst yourselves. But after you're done listening to me, of course, I don't want to spend a lot of time on each one of these. What I do want to do is say that in the age of 181, communication between local governments and the industry is going to be devilishly important. It's, that can't be understated. Everything that the local governments do and the staff people do, you're going to have to be asking yourself, is it reasonable? Is it reasonable and necessary? Because none of us want to end up in court again over the definition of these terms. So if you don't want to waste your local government's monies, and I know the industry doesn't want to spend all their time in court either, the communication that happens now going forward is going to be critical. With new power comes great responsibility in this process. And so I want, some of you know I say this at the Capitol every now and then. I say the time to do nothing is now, right? So take a deep breath before you decide to regulate. Take a deep breath and try to figure out how the state is going to continue its regulatory role before you rush into these new authorities. And the newest ones are related to enforcement. You don't need an MOU to do that anymore. Things like having your own financial assurance requirements. Things like developing your own fee or fine schedule. I don't think any of us would like to get a ticket here in Rifle and then have the state come in and overlay another fine over the top of you, right? You were speeding here. Let's not get into the double jeopardy scenarios. And those are the kinds of things that I think you are going to be asked to visit by people. And I would just caution about that. So keep in mind the time to do nothing is now. Possible effects to the state. I would, as I've thought about these terms likely, I think a lot of whether that becomes likely or not likely is going to depend on the attitudes of the people in this room. on the leadership of the people in this room to help describe not only, I put negative kinds of things from my standpoint that could happen here. There are other positive things that could come out of it in terms of a greater understanding of one another, greater understanding of the technology. I'm so glad you guys are taking a field trip today because I think you can see how technology has advanced. When I started lobbying in the oil and gas world 30x years ago, the distance between my hairline and my eyebrow was pretty short. This industry has really expanded its mind and has, as many good engineers do and know, you given a problem, you try to solve it. And the issues related to air quality, water quality, waste in the more traditional throwaway sense have been addressed and are being addressed. And we've quadrupled production in this state and we've halved the emissions. Now think about that for a minute. That is an amazing accomplishment. So I think it's important that you all understand that what happens in this state going forward is dependent on each and every one of you and how you approach this problem. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of energy talking about consequences because the consequences are in your hands now. I want to talk a little bit to my brothers and sisters in industry, but then I also want to talk to my cousins and aunts and uncles over in local government that I didn't prepare a slide for, but I'm thinking overnight have some thoughts about that. So we have to rebuild trust in many communities. In this part of the world, I think you have a pretty good trust equation going. People on both sides do what they say and mean what they say and implement on those in a way that there is trust by and large. We in the industry, I think, need to help change the narrative. I think we believe we do operate cleanly and safely. I think outside of a few or one incident, I think we have a pretty darn good track record. We need to do a better job of educate, but I sort of made this word up, and those of you that know me, like I was visiting with someone early, asked how I was. I said, I am peacherific. Well, we need to, in industry, emoticate, right? Policymakers make decisions on emotions, not just facts. And I think we have to bring a renewed passion to the table in order to get some things done. We need to empower ourselves. We need to volunteer in the community and like we've never done before. But more than that, we have to be elected. We have to be appointed to planning commissions. I sat on Jeffco's planning commission for 13 years, so I know what it's like to have the room full of people with pitchforks and tiki torches, you know, kill Frankenstein, and then you end up voting for Frankenstein and get followed to the parking lot. I think we have got to do a better job of participating from this side of the table in making those decisions and helping to develop that community trust. Locals. Need to consider, you guys need to consider your new role in opting for changes that are going to be allowed under this. I think you need to be prepared for the pitchforks and tiki torches and understand that you don't always have to go with the angry mob, that there will be a day after, and the future is what you need to keep your mind on. So, with all of that, I'm going to end because I'm getting the 10-minute signal to leave a little time for questions. I think what we all need to do is talk less and listen more. Communication is about listening more than it is about talking. So with that said, I will end and open up for any questions that you might have in your sleepy morning. I hope you've had your coffee. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm Tom Jankowski, Garfield County Commissioner. And the one thing that was in the bill, the one thing that was in the bill at one point was that there be no new permits until we've gone through the rulemaking process. And is that correct? Because that makes that's a huge impact on our county if there are no new permits. We've got our operators may have a year's worth of permits, and in this end of this county and for county government, we really rely on oil and gas property taxes to operate. And so is that, can you explain that?
I'll do my best. And that may be a better question for Jeff Robbins when he's here this afternoon. Part of why we were, in terms of that new gatekeeping process, I think they are going to have a letting those permits come through, the less controversial ones, come through and go through that process. So I believe there will be a permitting process. A lot is dependent on local governments now, because there's language in the bill that talks about you can't apply for the state permit until the disposition of your local permit has happened. There's some thinking that disposition may mean check the box at the local government that it's in process and therefore let the state permit go through. And then there are others that believe that this may mean you have to get your local permit first. So, and I think it's still, I can't answer you what happens to the 6,000 precisely, subject to that rule, but I think they will go through the state process because they were filed prior to the enactment of the law. But I think a number of these things have to still play out. So I would encourage you to ask that same question of Mr. Robbins. Your oatmeal's staring up at you, isn't it? Okay, well, yeah, one more.
So, is it on? No? It is? Okay. So, over here on the western slope, we are at a disadvantage because we don't know what's going on over it in the Capitol.
Well, then do what you want. No. I'm kidding for all of you local government people, but do what you want. No, I'm kidding.
By the way, I'm Jim Yellico, the Garfield County assessor. So what were the conversations like among the people in reference to 112? 181 seems like a law done by our legislators. What about, did they have any remarks or any credence to what happened with 112? And what was that like from your perspective?
That's an excellent question. And I'm going to answer this very delicately. I think that 112, the answers we got back were that, oh, that was about setbacks. This isn't about setbacks. The 181 is not about setbacks. From our perspective, I think it was about so much more than setbacks. But that was generally the answer. It's not about setbacks. The people voted on that, but we're doing something different, and we're changing it up. We want locals to be in charge and more control. So I think the tenor and the strength at which 112 went to defeat mattered not to those new representatives and current representatives who were in charge to carry this bill forward. They saw them as two separate issues. Okay, deep breath, everybody. You got a long day ahead of you. Maybe not a long day. Oh, one more. Yes, sir.
You know, you won't answer this question, but I watched the governor sign his bill yesterday and listened to his speech, and I heard him say more than once that the war on oil and gas is over in Colorado. And I don't know where the blankety blank that comment came from, but it is really, in my mind, was very disturbing that type of attitude was being taken by the leader of our state. So that's not a question, that's just a comment.
Thank you. All right, any others? Yes, sir.
Jim, thank you for coming. Mike Sampson, Garfield County Commissioner. Correct me if I'm wrong, but when I look at the term local control, I have a different concept than evidently the state does. Now, my perception is with this new law, local control means that whatever your entity is, the municipality, the county, you must hit this level of regulation. If you want to go above and beyond that, that is local control. But you do not have the option of lessening regulations and red tape and so on. Is that a correct statement?
I'd say half of that is correct.
Oh, educate me there then.
Okay, so on those items that you want to regulate, you can't go lower than the state's standard. You can, however, say, I'm not going to regulate in this particular arena because the state standard is enough. You cannot go below the state standard. That is the floor, not the ceiling. So if you choose, for example, not to have your own fine schedule, that the state's fine schedule works, you have your own inspectors, they find something, right? That's the kind of interplay I think that's going to happen on into the future. So there's nothing that mandates that you regulate or do anything different than you're doing today if you choose to, as a board of, I think, 3 commissioners here, to do that. And I think that's why I said earlier, the time to do nothing is now. It's to take a deep breath. It's to learn the extent of your authority. It's to consult your own legal resources, communicate with the state about questions that you may have, and then you have to decide whether you want to do more or do anything in that sense that's different than what you're doing today. So if it's working today, bully, move down the road. If you have to, as permits, move forward, you have to signal you're okay with it. Signal you're okay. You don't have to walk out on the plank of regulation if you don't wish to. So, does that make sense?
Yes, thank you for that. But I guess it brings to my mind, if you're familiar with the book 1984 by George Orwell, and there's a term in there called doublespeak. And that's what I refer to when they talk about local control. To me, that is not local control. They'll let you tighten the screws down if you want and make things more restrictive, and perhaps that's the case and needs to be done. And each entity has the right to decide that. But I'll just take a for instance here, as let's say, and I'll just use this because I think everybody in the room can relate to it, is we say the setbacks are not going to be 2,500 feet, 2,500 feet. We've decided that. And that's the state regulation. Now, the local control says, in Garfield County, that is devastating to us. And we don't want that. Sorry. But what happened to local control? Nope, no local control. That's the standard. You meet that. And all those places are now out of bounds for drilling and permits and so on. Too bad. That's where I'm coming from and so on. So I say it frustrates me when I hear people say it's local control because I say to myself, people don't understand. That's not local control. It's local control to make it more, but not less. So,
Well, as a famous president once said, feel your pain.
yeah, gotcha. I got you, but I don't want to talk about him either, so thank you.
Yes, sir.
John Justman, Mesa County Commissioner, and this looks like to me that on the west slope, Mesa County, the last few years have been better. The previous years when I was commissioner, we were struggling for money everywhere we turned. Things are getting better, and now we're going to revert back to where we were when I started as commissioner. I think there are companies already downsizing, leaving the area. The oil and gas industry is on wheels. They not tied to Colorado necessarily. One thing that could be helpful is the Jordan Cove project, but the governor is not taking a positive or maybe not a negative or a positive position on that. But we're sitting here looking at our budgets like, I don't know where we're going from here, but it doesn't look pretty. And we can take a deep breath, but that doesn't add money into the next year county coffers to keep the roads open and fixed and repaired and everything else we need. And I look at this, I come from agriculture. You can only feed, I've been told, a third or 3 billion people if the whole world was organic farming. The problem is there's 7 billion. We all want to eat. Everything we touch is connected to fossil fuels. There aren't any wind-powered, solar-powered tractors in the next 50 years. And agriculture uses where do you think fertilizer comes? A lot of it comes from natural gas, and we're trying to slow it down, stop it, and not that natural gas is, or fertilizer is made from natural gas out of Colorado, but it comes from somewhere. And I just have a hard time visualizing how this is going to be a good thing for Mesa County, other than, but maybe we have to take a deep breath, but we can't hold our breath for a couple years.
That's correct. I think you control your own destiny relative to how you want to participate in this new law, and that's not only what you would like to do at the local level. It is the law. I think you're going to, my recommendation would be to aggressively participate in these rulemakings that are happening at the state level to try to ensure that the standard, the bar doesn't get raised so high that capital leaves the state. I agree with you that companies are looking at their balance sheets right now and trying to decide where they're going to allocate capital. So signals from local governments that you're welcome here are going to be critical to retaining the industry in your counties. And I think a number of you that are in Garfield, Mesa, Weld, and perhaps some others are of like mind with you on that particular viewpoint. So I think you're going to have to spend energy being in the process at the State Oil and Gas Commission, helping them determine, these new commissioners, what level of regulation is appropriate given that sort of one-way ratchet that you brought up, Commissioner. So I can't change the law. I would encourage you to participate in its implementation full speed ahead.
How many more people are we going to have to hire to do all these things on that list?
Well, you can decide how many or none of those things on the list you want to do, I guess is my point. So if you decide to do things on the list, you will have to figure out a way to pay for it, no question about it. So maybe that acts as a check on some of the counties from expanding, or cities expanding their authorities, because you have to have a way to pay for it, and just slapping another fee on the industry isn't sending the right signal either. So I guess I'll just end there.
Jim, good morning. This is Kathleen Conti from Repeal County. My question to you is, if you were speaking to a local government who was saying to themselves, well, I know you're saying, take a deep breath and wait, but there were already additional, regulations that we were thinking about adding before 181 passed. I'm just curious what your comment would be back to those local governments who are in that situation and tempted to go ahead and add those to their current regulatory scheme work that they may already have in place before the state takes its position.
Wow, the sky is going to be pretty blue today, I think. Commissioner, I think that it's going to be up to the commissioners. If I were advising them, I would advise them to, before doing that, maybe having some different kind of stakeholder process involving the industry participants and so forth, and not just, put it on the agenda and slam it on through, because that is the kind of behavior that's going to result in the thing that this commissioner didn't want to have happen, and probably you don't either. So I think there's going to have to be a different kind of listening, as I said before, less talk, more listening before any action is taken. That would be my advice under this law. And perhaps you'll get enough information and education to make a decision that we don't have to add more, or that what the state is doing will be enough for what we need to focus on. I don't think the home building industry doesn't have two regulatory agencies to answer to by and large. By and large, it's the local. There isn't a sort of a statewide housing board that you have to get a permit from. It's a local. So I would advise you to slow down. Okay. Rock on.